Welcome to the fifth in this series of Sunday sessions, this season of overheard conversations. And it's a real joy tonight to be joined by my friend Deepa Patel. Welcome, Deepa. It's good to have
Thanks,
you.
Google.
It's funny, we've been talking for like 3 or 4 years. And it was a mutual friend, Mikkel Vanstad, who said, you two should have a conversation." And the three of us started meeting up every few weeks on a Wednesday morning. Um, and and there was a kind of gap for a while. And then in the autumn of last year, the two of us started talking again. And I remember that first conversation we had in the autumn, realizing that the two questions that I was sort of trying to name that were sort of burning for me by the second half of last year, one of them is what I often talk about in terms of making good ruins and what that looks like as a strategy. So how do we release resources from existing systems and structures to contribute to the conditions of possibility for worlds worth living in the times to come, on the far side of the ending of many of the promises and structures that the world as we've known it has been built around. So that was like the one question. And the other one that was really burning for me was to do with the role of faith in all of this, and that things that have been kind of marginalized or privatized or treated as old-fashioned and obsolete within the world of modernity, coming back to unexpected places in conversations in the worlds that I'm involved in, and me wanting to sort of articulate both my own relation to that and the sense of that being that belonging, that being right to the time that we're in, being something that's ripe and full of life and not just a kind of retreat into some sort of comfort zone. And as I was articulating that to you, it felt like there was so much overlap with the things that were mattering most to you as well. And yet when we get together for our conversations, we sort of never have an agenda or know what we're going to talk about. And I feel a bit like that tonight as well. And I always start these conversations by asking you to share a little bit about where you call home. What's home to you?
I really like this question because for me, I've said this before, I am third generation Kenyan of Indian heritage, and I've spent most of my life in England. And my late teens were really desperate times of trying to work out where I belonged. I grew up in a little English village. I went to India for the first time when I was 17, and it was very clear that I didn't belong to India. And Kenya didn't feel like home. And it was, in a way, it was the first moments of really tasting depression, I would say. That sense of belonging really led to a kind of despair in some ways. And then the saving grace came in my early 20s when bands like Asian Dub Foundation, Nitin Sawhney, Talvin Singh were all starting to make music. And the music that they were making was this mixture of punk, dance, Indian classical music, and this kind of different fusion. And I remember listening to that music and going, that's where I belong. I belong in that music. So I think I feel like music is what I often call home. If I'm trying to work out where I am, I have this thing, people who know me know that I say this a lot, which is if I'm trying to work out where I am in the world, then I listen to the song that my brain radio is playing. And usually it tells me what's going on. And it's always a kind of surprise to go, oh, that's what's going on internally. So yeah, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking the song that's coming is I'm Lost in Music.
Wow.
So Yeah, that's my home. That really is my home, which changes frequently and in many different ways.
Yeah. No, I can feel that. And I'm thinking about the word nostalgia, which
Mm.
refers to longing for home or the pain of longing for home, and how deeply music, nothing gets you faster into a state of being than music, and how you can inhabit the state of being of a particular piece of music, a particular kind of music. But I also, it's so funny that you described that thing of the radio in your head. Like, I sometimes laugh out loud because I suddenly notice the song that's going in my head and the words and the kind of way in which they form a commentary on what's going on in me. So that's like one of those things that probably lots of us do, but don't actually talk about to anyone. We think it's just a crazy thing that goes on in my head, but we clearly have that in common.
And Helen now asks me, Helen's one of my collaborators, she's like, what's the song? She takes pictures and I have songs. So when we work together, it's like I'm always kind of noticing what she's taking photographs of, and she's asking what's the song, because it usually leads us to a place we haven't got to yet. So
Yeah. It's the thing that part of you already knows that you need to let another part of you in on,
yeah.
which maybe like takes us to this language that kind of started almost as a joke, but that actually ended up framing this conversation tonight of you saying to me that you wanted to be a secret agent, and then you think, all right, that's what I'm going to announce you as. And then you said this wonderful thing. You said, well, yeah, in my tradition, we are agents of an open secret. So what's the secret, Deepa?
Oh, Dougal, if I tell you that.
Oh,
Oh, it's such a good question. Like, what is the secret? And I think the secret's always in this moment. Like, we are never going to have this moment again. I feel like a broken record that says this, this moment is never going to happen again. And I think that's the secret.
yeah.
We
I
don't
was,
we don't necessarily know how to be fully present to this moment.
yeah, sitting here on a Zoom call, like lots of Zoom calls that we've had before, except that somewhere out of shot, there's a whole lot of friends and strangers who are also listening in on this moment in our ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the idea of an open secret as being something that isn't hidden, isn't held onto tightly and kept out of view, but also is kind of inexhaustible in that you can't explain it and get to the bottom of it. So it's the bottomlessness of it that makes it retain this sense of secret, even as even as it's something that is offered up.
Hmm. It is exactly that.
Mhm.
It's I notice one of the things about you and I talking is it takes us a moment to like find our way into the conversation, and how important that is as well in terms of what you've just said for the secret. There's sort of like maybe a point of stilling. I think I might have made that word up just now, but becoming stiller. And so it always feels like we're diving into something we don't know yet. And I really like, I think this time I'm just really noticing how precious that is to have a conversation with someone where that's part of how one enters into it.
Yeah. Yes. It's like that moment of Oh, I wonder
Mhm.
which part of that inexhaustible open secret wants to show up tonight.
Yeah.
You said something to me when we were speaking the other day about your grandma.
Hmm. Well, she obviously wants to be here then, my grandma.
Yeah.
Um, she's a really special lady. She's like married at 15, which is just so extraordinary to think of it. And then, and she was an extraordinary organizer. So she organized all of the kind of Indian women in Nairobi, from everything from organizing weddings right through to, big celebrities that came to Kenya, right through to opening the space for people to vote. And so I sometimes I forget that I grew up with someone who was that kind of an organizer. And then as she arrived, she got to the age that in her late 40s, she discovered Sri Aurobindo and integral yoga and the mother. And well, she might have discovered them a little bit earlier, but that was very unusual for someone to kind of step away from the Hindu faith, which she was born into, to really study this kind of level of mysticism. And, she went to Oroville, to Pondicherry. She was a real devotee of, in a sense, a devotee to what we're just talking about, the ineffable, the complete open, unknown mystery of life. And my childhood was one of my favorite places was in her lap when she was meditating. And she was very generous because she'd let me do it. Of course, I was a child, so I wouldn't last very long, but there was just there was something there. And I think that in a way, that's when I became a seeker, and that was like, it was like I'd smell it. You were talking about smell earlier. I could completely smell what that was. I didn't know it, but sitting with her was that kind of like, yes, that. Um, so it's very nice to feel her presence because she learned how to drive at 50, which again was totally unusual for someone her age. And she had this little Fiat that she'd kind of tear around in. And yeah, she was just quite extraordinary. She never lost that absolute thirst for the light, as it were. And so she was my first teacher in a way.
And was that something that kind of rooted itself in you in childhood and was there with you all along? Was it something that you found yourself coming back to in a different way at some stage in life?
Yeah, I think there were two things. So, from a really young age, and I feel like children have that, I just could not bear to see injustice or inequity. And I lived in Nairobi, so it was there, but even at school or on the playground, there was just like something in me that would just fight. The moment I saw a child picking on another child or even grown-ups, it was that sense of injustice was really strong from it from when I was a kid. And I think the other was this like, there's something else in the world, and I want to know what it is. And in a way, my life has been lived. Those two are the kind of parallel paths that I have followed. So I was incredibly political in my early life, but also always searching for the spiritual. And that they've never kind of gone away. I was reading Krishnamurti and kind of going to my first protests, which was kind of youth CND to begin with. So it was those two have really, yeah, they're the lenses through which I look at life. And I think in finding Hazrat Inayat Khan, the Sufi teacher whose lineage that I'm in, It was like in fact, all of these things came home. He was a musician, one of the biggest musicians in India. So there was finding my home in music, justice, peace, those were a core part of the message, and mysticism. You know, all three came into alignment in this one being and on this path.
Yeah, when you said that about, the two things, the sense of justice on the one hand and the sense of there being something else, I feel like, I don't know whether this is true for you, but I feel like those things for me, when I think back to childhood, were kind of two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
That it's precisely the sense that there is something else, something more, that sustains the sense of justice. That if you don't have, and the way I put this, and I said this last year, and I must have been in a conversation with Gordon White, that, if you grow up, in my case, around churches, praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, for me anyway, that as a formula, there is a distance within that between how things are and how they ought to be, or how things are and how they were meant to be, how things are and how things could be. And it's precisely that distance that, sustains and animates a sense of justice. And I think that, I took that for granted as just part of the milieu of the family and community in which I was growing up. But I realized later on, I realized more and more in adult life that not everyone heads out into the world with a sense that there is more than how things are, or that there is any gap between how things are and how things inevitably must be. And that for me, the two things, the two sides of it, are bound up with each other. So I just wonder whether that resonates with your version of that kind of dual experience that you named.
I really, yeah, actually, when you say it, it really does. And I'm sort of realizing now that both are required. We were just talking about the fact that I'm on my way to Malawi at the end of this week to be working in the refugee camp. And if there's ever a place where those two things come together, justice and well, you used the word faith because that was one of the things that was coming. And I have a feeling when we talked, I had totally lost my sense of faith because of being in the refugee camps and of just not just being completely at a loss as to how we do this to each other. And so there's something about it's like you say, there's both the gap between them, but also that's where the bridge gets built. And I don't know, I think part of what we're looking at is what are these two things going to mean as they for our time? How will they sort of come together in a different way today, to unlike any other time that they've come together?
You said something to me as we were getting ready for the call tonight, and you said in this very matter-of-fact way, you say, "Oh, I mean, mysticism is very practical," and yeah, that completely fits with my experience of Deepa, even just from knowing you through conversations like this over screens and so on. But I'm really curious to, like, I don't think that's the first thing that. I think practical is the first word that comes into people's minds if you say mysticism. I don't think mysticism is the first word that comes into people's minds if you say practical. So can you build the bridge for us to why those things go hand in hand so self-evidently for you in your experience of showing up in the world? Because I'm totally, like, when I hear you say it, it's totally convincing in your way of being. But I'm just curious if you can, if it needs more words, if you can put more words to that.
I think it comes back to what I said about what's needed in this present moment. generally that's not the place where we operate from. But if we're fully present right in this moment, then whatever is needed for it, that the answer for it exists right there. And I think one of the things that I notice is that most of the time we're living in tomorrow. I noticed that about myself. I realized that was the case. But when I'm right here and you ask me what's needed, or I'm listening to with an inner ear to what wants to arise in this moment, then usually I found the solution to what's needed there and then. And that's why I think of, but what mysticism brings to it is that there's nowhere else to be but here.
Because everything is actually here already.
Right. Our past is here. I wouldn't be here if every single thing that had happened in my life hadn't happened. And that, even when that's been, horrifying in different ways for all of us, but just the fact that I couldn't have got here without every single moment is quite amazing. And that every single moment that will come is actually already here too. So it feels very practical to me. And we take that away from children who, of course, live here in the moment, right? And we somehow, our education system takes them out of that. It doesn't allow them to really know what it means to live fully here. They
Yes, I
need to
mean,
be taught it. We need to learn it from them. I mean, we were just talking about childish and childlike, right?
yes, because you were saying, people say Elon Musk is a visionary, but I don't feel that. And I said, yeah, I think it's because he feels childish rather than childlike. And you said visionaries are childlike, which, yes, I I want to know more about the tradition that you found yourself in, Deepa.
Mhm.
Because I'm like, I read a little bit about it. It's not something we've talked about directly, and yet I've felt it kind of like weaving just naturally through our conversations over the years. But I was reading a little bit more about it because I knew we were going to be doing this tonight, and I'm just curious to hear a bit more about it from you, and also about how you found yours, how you landed in it.
So how I landed in it is a really fun story. I landed in it because of a very dear friend who said, I'm going to an alchemy workshop. And I was like, I want to come to an alchemy workshop. Actually, it wasn't even a workshop, it was a retreat. I'm going to an alchemy retreat at Findhorn. And I'd never been to Findhorn, but I'd of course heard about Findhorn. So I was like, all right, I'm in. I'm gonna come. And at that time, I think, yeah, I really was seeking. I spent a long time with Krishnamurti. I then studied Tibetan Buddhism. I was doing a course in Kabbalah. You name it. I was like one of those terrible. I don't even know what the word is for them. So there I was in all of this, and I was like, I'm going to Findhorn to an alchemical retreat. And what was extraordinary about, so I didn't know what I was going to. And then when I showed up, um, there we were, and I found out that the teacher, the lineage holder, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was one of India's greatest musicians. And so that was like a moment of like, oh my God, this feels like home. And it felt like home because I realized that what we were talking about was becoming an instrument of the moment, I would say, which if anyone asks me, what am I doing? That's what I'm doing. I'm learning how to be an instrument of the moment, how to become, one of the phrases that he has is in tune with the infinite, in rhythm with the conditions of life, which is kind of what you were talking about. What does it mean to be in? So it was, just the idea of how important music was to that was really amazing. And I think one of the things that's incredible about Indian classical music, of course, is that it's a completely improvised art form. It's there's a note for the morning, which is different to the note for the evening, which is so suddenly it was like truly learning what that meant to become to improvise in that way. And I think I would say that that's one of the very strong qualities of this path, that inner life and the learning of it. And then it was that he had come in the 1900s, and the Theosophical Society was really strong at that time. And he was one of those other people that had been put up as, you know, one of the messiahs, as it were, which he totally rejected in terms of the role. But what came from that was also a real deep-rooted practice of universalism. Sufism is often talked about as the mystical part of Islam, and that's very true. And then it has this extra quality of universality. And so it was the first time that I felt like I wasn't in kind of a multi-faith, interfaith, superficial bath, but it was like, could I really hear the note? The way that he described it was each religion has a note, and you can study that note in and of itself, but our time gives us, we're in a time where we can hear the symphony.
Mm.
And so if we look at it that way, you have to know each note. You have to be able to sort of have that sense of it as you listen to the symphony. So that was that felt like a real really important to me as someone who was kind of searching for something else. And then this what's extraordinary is he'd also looked at how to live an ethical life. So there is within this tradition a knighthood where you study 40 rules. You study each rule for 40 days. And they're quite extraordinary in themselves. They sort of create a whole way. They feel like having different artists' material to work out how to live in life. And it has a healing path, and it has the mystical school. So it was like suddenly arriving in a garden and sort of going, wow, here is what I need. And I was not someone who ever thought I'd become a disciple. Like that was not a word that I would have associated with myself, because I think ultimately freedom, you know, if you ask me, then freedom is where it's at. And this is called the path of spiritual liberty. So that was another inkling that I'd arrived somewhere that I needed to learn from. But I think that becoming a disciple, taking on initiation in this path, because it's an initiatic path, was the first time that I started to learn about freedom from the place of discipline. And I think that the relationship between those two is something that's very different, which we can see in artists or writers. There is a kind of that relationship between discipline and freedom is always there. And I'd say that sits somewhere very deep inside of me.
Two things that are coming to mind, which are both stories that I've told here and there. One of them is somebody I knew who set up a human rights NGO in the Niger Delta and spent a lot of time in the villages there. And he said for a long time, he was kind of like puzzled by this thing, that there was this concept of the youth and the elders. There was no clear mapping of like age between the two things. You could be 50 and you could still be part of the youth, and no one thought that was strange. And he said, and gradually I realized that like you didn't stop being part of the youth until you had arrived at, this probably isn't how he worded it, but it's how I remember it, until you'd worked out what you were going to do with this lifetime. And there was no pressure that ought to have happened at the age of 25 or like 18 when you leave school, or 40 or whatever it was. It was just when it happened, you knew, and then you'd move from one category to another category. And it sounds a bit like that sense of coming home, and then of a freedom through discipline, a freedom through commitment, kind of echoes the thing that he was noticing there within that cultural context of a moment of recognition where you move from one state of being where you're kind of moving around, checking it all out, to another state of being where you're like, oh, I could spend the rest of my life like following the invitation of this path.
Yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely that. And as you say, I think there is a part of me that's like, yeah, and some part of me is never going to settle. You know, I still think of that last breath as that would be the ultimate settling, right? Which in terms of what am I here? What is there to do? How is there to be? So
The other thing that was coming to mind for me is a story which I picked up from Alan Garner, but which presumably comes from India from the beginning. So Vishnu is sitting high up on the slopes of Chomolungma, or Mount Everest, whatever we're calling it, and crying. And along comes Hanuman, the monkey god, and says, "Hey, Vishnu, why are you crying? And what are all those ants down there so excited about?" And Vishnu says, "They're not ants. They're people. I dropped the jewel of infinite wisdom and it's smashed into a million pieces, and they've all found a shard of it. And they're convinced that like they've found the jewel, and they're all running around telling each other, and no one's listening." And what I love about that story is that it has like after carrying it around for years, it began to dawn on me that there was a trick in it, because if we hear it and feel ourselves sat alongside the gods on the top of the mountain looking down with a sense of superiority, we're precisely reproducing the pattern of holding the shard and thinking that you've got the whole thing. And actually, the invitation of the story is to listen, and that we all start listening to each other and honoring the bit that we're carrying. And that was kind of coming to mind for me with your image of the symphony and of all of the different notes.
yeah, I would say that that listening feels, I mean, it sounds so trite to say it here, doesn't it? That feels so important. And on a daily basis, I'm like, wow, I'm really not a good listener. You know, it's sort of like if there was a practice, it's like, oh yeah, I wasn't there, I wasn't listening to that conversation. It's a really important, it's a craft to do it well. But it takes something quite, yeah, the level of concentration that's needed.
It's a practice. And what I like about the word practice is that it both means something that you have
Yeah,
developed and have skill in, and
totally.
something that you need to keep doing because it's how we get better at something that we're not that good at yet. And so listening as a practice.
I one of the places that I know when I'm not listening well because I'm ready to interrupt someone. And but that's such a that right now that's my kind of, I think in terms of taking up a practice, it's sort of recognizing which notch you know, where I'm at, and that's the practice at the moment. Where
Mm.
am I listening from? So I'm sorry if I've interrupted you. I
Ah,
think I have done.
it's the sort of rhythm and flow of conversation, and you were talking about improvisation as well. And
Yeah.
to me, that image that I threw in at the beginning of the open secret being still a secret, though it's open because of its inexhaustibility, because you haven't got to the bottom of it, and actually you never will. That's very closely connected for me to improvisation, because and to conversation, because every conversation is an improvisation. And an improvisation. So if an actor goes onto the stage with the resources of having learned a script which someone else wrote, and then they've been directed and they practiced it and they come there, now there's a great skill and gift in then showing up and bringing it to life. But what you're bringing onto stage in that situation is finite. When you step onto stage as an improviser, you're bringing something infinite
Mm.
onto stage. You won't ever run out of the lines that there are because you don't have a script. And to me, those are like conversation, improvisation, the open secret that remains a secret because of its inexhaustibility are all kind of three aspects of the same thing.
I like that it's three.
Yeah.
What did threes mean to you, Dougal? I don't know why I'm going down this road, but I'm intrigued.
Um, relationality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, threes, you ask me that question, and immediately the Trinity comes to mind as the thing which, is probably the most perplexing, well, one of the more perplexing aspects of Christianity, being this kind of a monotheism that's also a three fold. Um, God, a Jewish friend said this about being in an interfaith situation and someone being like, well, sort of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we all believe in the same God. She's like, hang on a minute, you've got three of them. So that, to be honest, is like in the context of this conversation, when you go, what do threes mean? That's part of what comes to mind.
In Sufism, we
Mm.
talk about love, lover, and beloved.
Mm.
That's the three that we're referring to here. And what it means to know, what it means to know love, to know what it means to be a beloved, and to know what it means to be a lover is quite that in itself is a whole study as well.
Yeah. So yeah, threes and relationality again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I sometimes think that I sometimes wonder if a lot of damage was done by, you know, white men going out from Europe at a certain point in modern history and mapping the ways of inhabiting the world, the ways of relating to the visible and the invisible that everyone has, as this set of things called religions that are placed alongside each other, which in the early version of that, it's like they're all basically being mapped as defective forms of Christianity, because that's the type for what a religion is that the people who were
Mm-hmm.
doing the mapping and had the voice were saying. And I wonder, like, because at the moment where your lineage kind of came to Europe in the early 20th century, there's this kind of modernist drive around to kind of to unify, to synthesize, to create a universalism in a modern sense, where it would be like, well, now before we were like children, and now we've grown up, and so we have the unified truth. And modernity is full of these attempts to pursue a unified truth. But that's not what the kind of universalism that you speak of and
And of
from.
course and it's of course very ancient if you think about the Moors and Spain and even Araby. So it's been around for a long time. Yeah, I wonder whether, I mean, we get down to maybe a word like union, mm, maybe even more than universalism, which again would take us to communion
Yes.
and that whole idea of relationality. But that comes up, that there's a union, um, in particular, the union of the opposites.
Mm.
What does that look like? One of the things that is ever present in the alchemical process is becoming aware of the opposites. And I feel like that again is something whenever I'm in a place where I can't quite work out what's going on or how I'm feeling, then I'll often go to where are the opposites right
Mm.
now? Because that feels like another place for a different kind of, that union of the opposites it feels like a really potent place, because it brings up the irreconcilable. Like, what do we do with the irreconcilable? How are we going to hold that? So I jumped there from you talking about universalism, but I think that in some ways is part of what I'm looking at, which isn't necessarily unification. There is, of course, there is the idea that there is only one, that cosmology is an important part of it. But what does that mean in terms of multiplicity is a really interesting thing. When I'm trying to explain this to kids, occasionally I've been like asked to talk about this. I talk about a friend of mine who is all he wears is Converse. He wears every single type of Converse, that you can think about, but Converse is his thing. Whereas I'm the kind of person that's like, I love shoes. I can walk into a shoe shop and go, those shoes, those shoes. I can't think of anything worse than having to just wear Converse, right? And sometimes I think what we get caught in is those different things. But ultimately, what we're talking about is shoes.
Yes.
We don't get away from shoes. It's just where and it feels often like the easiest way is to look at that. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and both are needed, right? Someone.
That's what I was hearing when you talked about union and then union of opposites. Is the union of opposites is not something in which the opposites dissolve.
Yeah.
It, yeah. It's not something in which they are synthesized into something that replaces the outmoded or earlier in the story opposites, which isn't that everything has to stay fixed either. And that, yeah, that feels full of life for me as a way into these kinds of conversations. And I'm realizing I don't have the egg timer because the egg timer broke last time around when Jay Springett spoke about atemporality, cast a spell on the egg timer. But it's time to say goodbye to the people who are watching the recording on YouTube. And we're going to start to take some questions. So I'm going to unpin us.